Ma'am, come with me now. But my post. No time. Move! All right, lead the way. This way.
The loudspeaker crackled with urgency as Captain Jasmine Porter approached the cockpit door at Boston Logan Airport, her pilot credentials hanging proudly around her neck. But before she could enter, a hand shot out, blocking her path. The airline. Supervisor's eyes narrowed with suspicion as he studied her uniform, his voice dripping with condescension as he declared she was too young and clearly unqualified to be flying today's jumbo jet. Jasmine's heart pounded, not from fear but from the realization that this moment would change everything. Because what this supervisor didn't know was that Jasmine had just discovered something catastrophic in the maintenance records, something that could kill everyone on board Flight 447, and in the next few hours, she wouldn't just fight for her right to enter that cockpit, she would expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of corporate aviation. If you love stories about courage and justice prevailing against all odds, hit that like button right now and subscribe to Echo Story for more incredible tales that will leave you speechless, Captain. Jasmine Porter had dreamed of flying since she was 7 years old, watching planes soar overhead from her grandmother's backyard in Atlanta. Now at 32, she had logged over 8,000 flight hours and held certifications that pilots twice her age envied. But standing at Gate 19 in Boston Logan International Airport, none of that seemed to matter. Airline Supervisor Derek Matthews stood before her with his arms crossed, his expensive suit jacket straining against his chest as he blocked the jetway entrance. Behind him, the Boeing 787 Dreamliner sat gleaming on the tarmac, filled with 327 passengers who had no idea their scheduled departure was about to become a nightmare. Jasmine held out her credentials once more, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her. Matthews barely glanced at the ID before shaking his head dismissively, declaring that the real captain hadn't arrived yet, and she needed to return to the gate area immediately. The confrontation drew a crowd within seconds. Passengers waiting to board Flight 447 to Los Angeles pulled out their phones, recording every moment as Jasmine calmly explained that she was indeed Captain Porter, the pilot in command for today's cross-country journey. Matthews raised his voice louder, insisting that there must be some mistake in the scheduling system because the captain he was expecting was supposed to be someone with more experience. His words hung in the air, the unspoken implication clear to everyone watching. Jasmine felt the familiar sting of discrimination, the same feeling she had experienced countless times throughout her career, but today something was different. Today she had seen something in the digital maintenance logs that made her blood run cold, evidence of systematic safety violations that put every single passenger at risk. She needed to get into that cockpit not just to prove her authority, but to prevent a disaster. Matthews pulled out his radio and called for airport security, claiming there was an impersonator attempting to breach restricted areas. 2 airport security officers arrived within minutes, their expressions shifting from alertness to confusion as they took in the scene. Officer Maria Santos recognized Jasmine immediately from a news feature about groundbreaking pilots, but her partner, Officer James Wheeler, seemed less certain. Jasmine presented her credentials with practiced precision, explaining that she had every right to access the aircraft and that this delay was jeopardizing the flight schedule. Matthews interjected repeatedly, insisting that regulations required additional verification for such a high-profile route. The passengers grew increasingly agitated, several calling out in Jasmine's defense while others filmed the entire encounter. A well-dressed businessman stepped forward and vouched for having flown with Captain Porter before, praising her skill and professionalism. Officer Santos examined Jasmine's airline ID, pilot license, and security clearance, all of which were perfectly legitimate and current. She turned to Matthews with barely concealed frustration, pointing out that every credential was in order and there was no legitimate reason to prevent Captain Porter from boarding. Matthews' face flushed red as he realized his authority was crumbling. While the argument escalated, Jasmine's mind raced back to what she had discovered just 40 minutes earlier in the crew briefing room. She had been reviewing the aircraft's electronic logbook, a routine check that most pilots performed before every flight, when she noticed irregularities in the maintenance signatures. 3 critical systems, including the hydraulic pressure monitors and the backup flight control computers, showed completion stamps from a technician whose certification had been revoked 2 months ago. Even more disturbing, the inspection dates overlapped in impossible ways, suggesting someone had falsified the records to make it appear that proper safety checks had been completed. Jasmine had immediately contacted the maintenance supervisor, a gruff veteran named Tom Hendricks, who had dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. He claimed the electronic system sometimes duplicated entries and that she was worrying over nothing. But Jasmine's instincts, honed by years of training and experience, screamed that something was very wrong. She had taken screenshots of the maintenance logs on her personal phone before heading to the gate, determined to investigate further once airborne Officer Santos finally put her foot down, declaring that Captain Porter had every right to board her aircraft and that any further delays would be reported as interference with flight operations. Matthew stepped aside reluctantly, his jaw clenched in barely suppressed anger, but not before muttering under his breath about quota hires and affirmative action. Jasmine heard every word but chose not to respond, knowing that engaging would only delay her further. She thanked Officer Santos professionally and proceeded down the jetway, her rolling flight bag trailing behind her. The passengers began boarding shortly after, many stopping to offer words of encouragement or apologize for what they had witnessed. A young black girl, no more than 10 years old, tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed at Jasmine with wide eyes, whispering that she wanted to be a pilot too someday. Jasmine paused to kneel down and speak with the child, handing her a pair of plastic pilot wings from her pocket, a moment of connection that reminded her why she fought so hard to stay in this profession despite all the obstacles. Inside the cockpit, Jasmine met her first officer, David Chun, a talented pilot in his late 40s with over 15,000 flight hours. David had already completed most of the pre-flight checklist and greeted Jasmine with professional courtesy, though she detected a hint of curiosity in his expression. Word of the confrontation at the gate had clearly reached him through the crew communications channel. Jasmine settled into the left seat, the captain's position, and began her own verification of the aircraft systems. She pulled up the maintenance logs on the flight management computer and showed David the irregularities she had discovered earlier. His relaxed demeanor shifted instantly to concern as he examined the entries, his finger tracing the impossible timeline of inspections. They both knew that flying with questionable maintenance was not just against regulations, it was potentially suicidal. David suggested they delay the flight and demand a full inspection, but Jasmine shook her head, explaining that the airline's leadership would likely override them and assign a different crew. She had a different plan, one that would require careful timing and irrefutable evidence. As the boarding process continued, Jasmine discreetly photographed every page of the maintenance logs, making sure to capture the falsified signatures and impossible dates. She then accessed the airline's internal personnel database, which captains were authorized to view, and confirmed that the technician whose signature appeared on the recent inspections had indeed lost his certification after failing a recertification exam. Even more damning, she discovered that this same technician had been contracted through a third-party maintenance company that the airline had hired to cut costs, a decision that apparently involved bypassing normal quality control procedures. Jasmine forwarded all the evidence to her personal email and cloud storage, creating multiple backups. She then contacted the airline's chief pilot through a secure channel, bypassing Matthews entirely, and reported her findings with calm precision. The response was swift and bureaucratic, a terse message instructing her to proceed with the flight as scheduled and submit a formal report after landing. Jasmine realized with growing horror that the airline was willing to risk passenger lives to avoid the expense and embarrassment of a delayed flight, Flight 447. Pushed back from the gate 17 minutes late, the delay officially attributed to a minor paperwork issue. The passengers settled into their seats, unaware of the ticking time bomb beneath them. Jasmine and David completed their taxi checklist with methodical precision, both hyper-aware of every sound and vibration from the aircraft. As they waited, For takeoff clearance, Jasmine made a decision that would define her entire career. She contacted air traffic control and declared a precautionary ground emergency, citing concerns about the aircraft's airworthiness based on maintenance discrepancies. The controller's voice crackled back with surprise but professional acknowledgement, directing them to taxi to a remote maintenance area. David looked at Jasmine with a mixture of respect and apprehension, knowing that what she had just done would trigger a massive response from airline management. Within seconds, Jasmine's phone exploded with angry calls and text messages from supervisors demanding she cancel the emergency and return to the gate. She ignored them all, her focus entirely on ensuring the aircraft was properly inspected before it carried anyone into the sky. The scene at the remote maintenance pad was chaos. Airline executives arrived in company vehicles, their faces twisted with fury. Derek Matthews led the charge, screaming that Jasmine had sabotaged a profitable flight and would face immediate termination. But Jasmine stood her ground, surrounded now by FAA inspectors who had been automatically notified of the ground emergency. She presented her evidence with clinical precision, walking the federal investigators through each falsified signature and impossible inspection date. The lead FAA inspector, a stern woman named Rebecca Walsh, grew increasingly grim as she reviewed the documentation. Walsh immediately ordered a full structural inspection of the aircraft, summoning additional technicians and specialists. What they found over the next 3 hours validated every one of Jasmine's concerns. The hydraulic system had dangerously low fluid levels. The backup flight computers had corrupted software that would have failed catastrophically during flight, and several critical sensors had been bypassed entirely. Had Flight 447 taken off, it likely would have experienced total system failure somewhere over the Midwest, with catastrophic results. As the full scope of the maintenance fraud became clear, the FAA expanded their investigation beyond just Flight 447. Inspector Walsh ordered an immediate inspection of the airline's entire fleet, grounding 27 aircraft across the country. The ripple effects were instantaneous and devastating for the airline. Thousands of passengers were stranded, billions in market value evaporated, and the media descended on Boston Logan Airport like vultures. Jasmine found herself at the center of a whirlwind, praised by safety advocates and passengers while being vilified by airline executives and shareholders who blamed her for the financial catastrophe. But the evidence was irrefutable. Federal investigators discovered that the airline had been using unlicensed contractors for over 18 months, falsifying maintenance records to meet operational schedules while cutting costs. The conspiracy reached into the upper levels of airline management, including the vice president of operations who had personally approved the use of the fraudulent maintenance company. Jasmine's actions had prevented not just one disaster but potentially dozens as inspectors found similar issues across the entire fleet. The investigation expanded rapidly over the following days, with federal prosecutors getting involved. Jasmine was placed on administrative leave, which the airline framed as standard procedure but which everyone understood was retaliation for her whistleblowing. She spent hours being interviewed by FBI agents, FAA officials, and Department of Transportation investigators. The media coverage intensified, with Jasmine's confrontation at the gate being replayed endlessly on news channels. The video of Derek Matthews blocking her from the cockpit became a viral sensation, sparking national conversations about discrimination in aviation and the treatment of black professionals. Jasmine received thousands of messages of support, but also vicious hate mail from people who believed she had overreacted or manufactured the safety concerns. Through it all, she maintained her composure, knowing that the evidence would speak for itself. Her attorney, a fierce civil rights lawyer named Patricia Morrison, began building cases both for wrongful termination and for the discrimination Jasmine had faced. The airline tried to paint Jasmine as a rogue pilot who had violated procedures, but that narrative collapsed when more employees came forward. The whistleblowers emerged gradually, emboldened by Jasmine's courage. Aircraft mechanics, gate agents, and even other pilots contacted investigators with stories of being pressured to ignore safety concerns, falsified documents, or looked the other way when regulations were violated. One mechanic, a 20-year veteran named Robert Cruz, testified that he had been fired 6 months earlier for refusing to sign off on incomplete inspections. Another pilot revealed that she had been demoted after reporting concerns about crew fatigue violations. The pattern was clear and damning. The airline had created a culture where profits superseded safety, where employees who raised concerns were punished, and where systematic fraud had become standard operating procedure. Federal prosecutors filed criminal charges against 8 executives, including the CEO and the vice president of operations. The charges ranged from conspiracy to commit fraud to reckless endangerment. The airline's stock price plummeted, losing 70% of its value in a matter of weeks. Jasmine watched the collapse from her apartment in Boston, feeling no satisfaction in the destruction, only relief that no one had died because of the airline's greed. 3 months after grounding Flight 447, Jasmine received an unexpected phone call. It was from the head of the National Transportation Safety Board, requesting her testimony before Congress. A Senate committee had convened special hearings on aviation safety and corporate accountability, and Jasmine's case had become the centerpiece of their investigation. She traveled to Washington, D.C., walking through the marble halls of the Capitol building with a mixture of pride and trepidation. The hearing room was packed with journalists, aviation industry representatives, and families of passengers who had been on Flight 447. Jasmine sat at the witness table, sworn in under oath, and spent 4 hours detailing everything she had discovered. She explained the technical aspects of the maintenance fraud, the culture of intimidation that silenced employees, and the discrimination she had faced when trying to perform her duties. Several senators praised her courage and called her a hero, while others, clearly influenced by airline lobbyists, tried to suggest she had exaggerated the danger. Jasmine remained calm and factual, letting the evidence speak for itself. The congressional hearings triggered a wave of legislative action. Within 6 months, Congress passed the Aviation Safety Whistleblower Protection Act, nicknamed the Porter Act in Jasmine's honor. The law provided unprecedented protections for employees who reported safety violations, including financial rewards for substantiated claims and severe penalties for companies that retaliated against whistleblowers. Additionally, the FAA implemented new regulations requiring independent verification of all maintenance work, eliminating the ability of airlines to use uncertified contractors. The airline that had employed Jasmine never recovered from the scandal. After declaring bankruptcy and selling off its assets, it ceased operations entirely. Derek Matthews, the supervisor who had blocked Jasmine from the cockpit, was fired and subsequently charged with obstruction of justice for attempting to interfere with a federal investigation. He pleaded guilty and received probation, but his career in aviation was over. The maintenance company executives received prison sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. Justice moved slowly but thoroughly, dismantling the entire corrupt apparatus piece by piece. Jasmine's personal vindication came in an unexpected form. She received job offers from 6 different airlines, each eager to associate themselves with her reputation for integrity and safety. But she turned them all down, choosing instead to accept a position as the FAA's Director of Safety Compliance, a newly created role designed to prevent the kind of fraud she had exposed. In this position, Jasmine had the authority to conduct surprise inspections of any airline, review maintenance records without notice, and shut down operations if she found violations. She approached the work with the same meticulous attention to detail that had saved Flight 447. Over the next 2 years, she identified and corrected safety issues at 17 different airlines, always prioritizing passenger welfare over corporate profits. Her reputation in the industry became legendary. Airline executives feared her inspections but couldn't deny that she made aviation safer. Pilots revered her as someone who had stood up for what was right even when it cost her everything. Young people entering the aviation field, especially women and minorities, looked to her as proof that merit and courage could overcome discrimination. The anniversary of Flight 447's grounding became an annual event in aviation circles. Safety conferences held special sessions examining the case as a teaching moment about the importance of speaking up. Jasmine was invited to speak at these events, where she always emphasized that she wasn't special or heroic, just someone who had refused to compromise on safety. She talked about the loneliness of standing alone against institutional pressure, the fear of losing everything she had worked for, and the moral clarity that came from knowing lives depended on her actions. She also spoke candidly about the discrimination she had faced, not to play the victim, but to illustrate how systemic bias could literally kill people by preventing qualified professionals from doing their jobs. Her speeches were powerful and moving, often ending with standing ovations. But Jasmine always deflected the praise, insisting that real change required more than individual heroism. It required systems that protected and empowered people to do the right thing, and consequences severe enough to deter corporate malfeasance. Derek Matthews' fall from grace was complete and public. After losing his job and facing criminal charges, he attempted to rebuild his life working for a small regional airline in a non-supervisory role. But his past followed him. Someone at his new workplace recognized him from the viral video and shared it with colleagues. Within days, he was confronted by employees who refused to work with someone who had such a clear record of discrimination and poor judgment. He resigned before he could be fired again. Matthews eventually left the aviation industry entirely, taking a job in logistics that kept him far from airports and airplanes. In rare interviews, he claimed to have been made a scapegoat, insisting he had just been doing his job and following protocols. But the court documents and testimony told a different story, one of a man who had let his prejudices and ego endanger hundreds of lives. Some people suggested Jasmine should forgive him, should show mercy to someone whose life had been destroyed. Jasmine's response was always the same. She bore him no personal ill will, but actions had consequences, and he had earned every bit of his downfall. The passengers of Flight 447 never forgot what Jasmine had done for them. Several organized a reunion event 1 year after the incident, inviting Jasmine as the guest of honor. She walked into the hotel ballroom to thunderous applause from people who knew they owed their lives to her professional judgment and moral courage. Families approached her with tears in their eyes, thanking her for making decisions that had allowed them to see their children graduate, celebrate anniversaries, and experience moments they would have missed if Flight 447 had taken off. A man named Thomas Bradford, who had been traveling to his daughter's wedding, presented Jasmine with a framed photo from the ceremony. He explained that every time he looked at that picture, he thought of her and the gift she had given him. The emotional weight of these encounters never got easier for Jasmine. She hadn't saved these people to be celebrated. She had done it because it was her job and her duty. But seeing their faces and hearing their stories reinforced why she had fought so hard and why she continued to fight for aviation safety every single day. Jasmine's impact extended far beyond the aviation industry. She became a sought-after speaker on ethics, leadership, and standing up to institutional pressure. Business schools used her case as a teaching tool about corporate responsibility and the cost of prioritizing short-term profits over long-term safety. She wrote a memoir titled Grounded: One Pilot's Fight for Safety and Justice, which became a bestseller and was optioned for a major motion picture. The book detailed not just the dramatic events of Flight 447, but her entire journey in aviation, including the countless small acts of discrimination she had endured, the mentors who had supported her, and the technical passion that had drawn her to flying in the first place. Proceeds from the book went to a scholarship fund she established for aspiring pilots from underrepresented communities. Jasmine wanted to ensure that future generations wouldn't face the same barriers she had, that talent and dedication would be recognized regardless of race or gender. The scholarship program flourished, sending dozens of young people through flight training and into successful aviation careers. On a crisp autumn morning 5 years after grounding Flight 447, Jasmine returned to Boston Logan Airport for the first time since the incident. She was there for the dedication of a new training facility named in her honor, the Captain Jasmine Porter Center for Aviation Safety Excellence. The facility would provide state-of-the-art training for pilots, mechanics, and safety inspectors, with a special focus on ethical decision-making and speaking up about safety concerns. As Jasmine stood at the podium during the dedication ceremony, she looked out at a crowd that included FAA administrators, airline executives, congressional representatives, and many of the passengers from Flight 447. She spoke about the responsibility that came with every flight, the sacred trust between crew and passengers, and the absolute necessity of putting safety above all other considerations. Her voice was strong and clear, carrying the authority of someone who had proven her convictions through action. After the ceremony, Jasmine walked through the terminal to Gate 19, the same gate where Derek Matthews had tried to block her path. A plaque now hung on the wall there, commemorating the events of that day and honoring the principle that safety must always come first. As Jasmine stood at Gate 19, she noticed a young black woman in a pilot's uniform approaching. The woman stopped and introduced herself as First Officer Angela Williams, explaining that she had been inspired to pursue aviation after seeing Jasmine's story on the news. Angela shared that she had just completed her first month as a commercial pilot and that every time she faced doubt or discrimination, she thought about Jasmine's courage. Jasmine listened with pride and then offered Angela the same advice she gave to all young aviators: trust your training, verify everything, never compromise on safety, and never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong in that cockpit. They talked for several minutes about the challenges and joys of flying, about the progress that had been made and the work still left to do. As they parted ways, Jasmine watched Angela walk confidently toward her aircraft, and she knew that the fight had been worth it. The system wasn't perfect, discrimination still existed, and there would always be people who prioritized profits over people. But there were also more voices willing to speak up, more systems in place to protect whistleblowers, and more young people like Angela who refused to be discouraged. Today, Captain Jasmine Porter continues her work as the FAA's Director of Safety Compliance, conducting inspections and ensuring that the lessons of Flight 447 are never forgotten. The aviation industry is safer because of her actions, with enhanced regulations, better oversight, and a culture that increasingly values safety over shortcuts. The executives who authorized the maintenance fraud are serving their prison sentences. Constant reminders that corporate crimes have real consequences. The passengers of Flight 447 go about their lives, many of them never missing an opportunity to share the story of the pilot who saved them. Jasmine's legacy is written in the lives not lost, the disasters prevented, and the culture changed. She proved that one person standing firm on principle can change an entire industry. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what's right despite the cost. Her story, shared here on EcoStory, reminds us all that integrity matters, that speaking truth to power is never easy but always necessary, and that the guardians of safety are only effective when they're empowered and protected. The skies are safer because Captain Jasmine Porter refused to be silent, refused to be intimidated, and refused to let anyone die on her watch.